Thanks, Ollie. Yeah, I think maybe the sort of title should be the bankruptcy of official left Labourism, but we'll come to that in the course of the discussion. Well, I suppose the place to begin is the election of Corbyn. That was the result, as we all know, of the morons lending him his vote in the name of humiliating the Labour left. The Labour right really did believe that they'd finished off the Labour left. John McDonnell stood in the leadership, I think, a couple of times, didn't get anywhere. Diane Abbott stood and was humiliated. And then we got Corbyn onto the ballot, and it was, famously, wasn't it, X minutes to the hour, and he got his final nomination. I thought that was really good. I didn't think it would particularly go anywhere myself until I actually saw the first debate that the BBC staged, which was from my memory, from Nuneaton. And this was in front of former Labour voters. And we had all of the sort of plastic candidates lined up, plus Corbyn. And it was Corbyn that was getting the applause. It was Corbyn that was actually enthusing this audience. Now, given that the Labour right had also, against the opposition of the left, opened up leadership elections to supporter status, you could pay £3. It became, how should you put it, a scene of mass influx into the Labour Party. I think the mathematics of it always were that Corbyn would have won anyway, but the margin of his victory clearly owed a huge amount to new people joining or rejoining, or people taking out this £3 membership. And of course, the right were absolutely, how should I put it, dumbfounded by this. It was the last thing that they expected. And the same goes for the entire establishment. If you look at the Financial Times after the event, it was writing editorials along the lines of, well, we thought we had two parties of capitalism, two parties that the system would be safe under. Now all of that is in jeopardy. We cannot allow this. That was in an editorial. Okay, who came in to the Labour Party? Again, two things stand out: young people. I think it was, in terms of the demographics, people between the ages of 18 to 25, thereabouts, joined. And then you had older people who'd been around politics, knew what to expect in the Labour Party. And I would guess an awful lot of them were returnees in general after the Blair years, in particular, of course, the Iraq War. To me, this was an entirely positive development that the left really should have grasped with both hands. It really was an accident of history, but on the other hand, an accident of history that provided a organizational expression for mass discontent that existed in society. We all remember the anti-war protests, and there were many other such movements. But what this influx into the Labour Party represented was going beyond the politics of protest into organized politics. What tends to happen, with demonstrations, is that the vast majority of people who attend a demonstration don't join up to an organization. They go along to the demonstration, and then they're atomized. Their unity is temporary, momentarily. Joining the Labour Party, on the other hand, put them all under the same roof, and allowed them, or at least allowed the possibility of harnessing that mass membership to transform the Labour Party. And of course, that was something that the establishment feared. It was something that the PLP right wasn't going to tolerate. Nonetheless, that is what happened. Now, of course, then we come to December 2019 and the defeat of the Labour Party at the hands of Boris Johnson's Tory party. To me, this represented a defeat of the official Labour left. It also represented, I think, a body blow to those on the left who put the election of a Labour government at the centre of their strategy for socialism. So I'm thinking in particular of socialist appeal, but also those outside the Labour Party, such as the Communist Party of Britain, the Morning Stars Communist Party, which in terms of their British road to socialism, or Britain's road to socialism, is predicated on the election of a Labour government, which under mass pressure moves steadily to the left, to the point where capitalism is abolished and they establish socialism. Well, nowadays, I don't know what they count as socialist countries, but in essence, they establish a British socialism. To me, the defeat of the Labour Party in December 2019 was a body blow against that strategy that's adhered to both by those in the Labour Party and outside the Labour Party. Because here you had in Jeremy Corbyn, their inspiring leader, almost their ideal leader. You know, who else could you possibly want? In John McDonnell, you had their inspiring chancellor, you know, shadow chancellor. And of course, in Time for Real Change and the programme of 2017, what you had is their dream manifesto. And yet the Labour Party went down bad in terms of a defeat. You know, in parliamentary terms, the nearest we'd seen to it was 1935, and it should be pointed out in 1935 that the Labour Party vote actually went up, and of course that general election was in conditions of a national government led by that traitor Ramsay MacDonald, the former Labour Prime Minister. So this wasn't the equivalent of 1935. They didn't face a national government. They've certainly faced traitors in the Labour Party, but nonetheless, there's no disguising the extent of the defeat. Now, whether Corbyn should have toughed it out and not stood down, that I'm not going to discuss. All we know is that before the results of the general election were announced, you had people like John McDonnell saying that, you know, if we lose, of course Jeremy will step down. And I think in his head, he thought that Rebecca Long Bailey was going to be a shoo-in, and what you'd have is the Labour Party's first female leader and a continuity leader taking forward the politics of John McDonnell, the campaign group, Jeremy Corbyn. And in essence, I suppose they might have imagined themselves to be backseat drivers. Either way, we know what happened. She went down to a very bad defeat at the hands of Keir Starmer. Now we need to ask ourselves, you know, why this defeat in 2019? After all, if we look back a couple of years before that, 2017, In reality, it was Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party that won that general election, and it was Theresa May's Tory party that lost. So although the Tories were the biggest party in Parliament, she really expected to walk over the Labour Party. I mean, that was the truth of it. The opinion polls showed, a clear Tory lead. There you had this crazy guy, Jeremy Corbyn leading the Labour Party. It was going to be a walkover. Well, instead of that, the Labour Party gained votes, gained seats, and temporarily at least silenced the Labour Party right. So why did the Tories win so convincingly? And we can get into arguments about percentages and first past the post, but nonetheless, the Labour Party lost, the Tory party won. Why? I think a number of things. The crucial one, though, I think, is Brexit. The Labour Party, didn't have didn't have a consistent position on the EU, was kidded to go along with the David Cameron referendum in the same way. In my view, at least, they were kidded to go along with David Cameron's referendum in Scotland in 2014. Under those circumstances, what you saw with the Labour Party is its vote. I don't know in terms of what percentages, but there was a significant minority of Labour voters that put Brexit at the top of their agenda. A majority of Labour Party voters and members, as far as I understand it, were anti-Brexit, but in conditions of where Boris Johnson rode to power in the Tory party, slogan, get Brexit done, and then went to the country in a general election whose main theme was get Brexit done. It didn't really surprise me or many people, surely, that the Tories, broke into the red wall constituencies and scored, what was it, an 80-strong majority. The other factor is that in 2017, Brexit wasn't the issue it was in 2019. But, in that period, we saw Labour MPs lining up to humiliate Theresa May in Parliament. That was great fun. But if you were a Labour voting Brexit supporter, you would have viewed that as betrayal because the Labour Party had pledged, I think wrongly, to respect the result of the referendum. And under those circumstances, to see Labour voting again and again and again to defeat Theresa May's Breno version of Brexit, basically put those voters into the arms of the Brexit party, first of all, and then inevitably, as the general election ground on, Brexit party support collapsed and drained to those who were really going to get Brexit done. The other factor, I believe, was Jeremy Corbyn himself, in particular, the whole anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism campaign. In 2017, they tried to dress him up as a pro-terrorist, a Czech agent, someone who was pro-IRA. None of that really worked. But I think by 2019, the anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism campaign was definitely working. And what it resulted in is Corbyn coming over as weak. There he was shifting all over the place when it came to the EU. And there he was, allowing one friend, one supporter after the other to be thrown to the wolves. Meanwhile, in terms of his own Labour Party bureaucracy with Jenny Formby saying that we're searching out these people, there's a genuine problem, In other words, he came over as incoherent. And in terms of the election manifesto, the promise was that basically economic issues would win. That if you offered to give people pay rises and end the age of austerity, this would sweep aside such questions as Brexit, Israel, international politics. Well, it didn't. Um, so the Labour Party went down to a bad defeat. And of course, then what we saw is the Labour left put up Rebecca Long Bailey. And what we had is a situation of an awful lot of people who clearly had joined the Labour Party, clearly an awful lot of people in the Labour Party who had voted for Jeremy Corbyn, then went over to Keir Starmer. And they went over to Keir Starmer because the Labour left and the Labour right, or should I say the official Labour left and the official Labour right, are united on one thing. And that is the Labour Party exists in order to win general elections. It's an election machine. And if you lose an election, that's the worst thing conceivable. So you look around at the candidates on offer and you choose yourself a winner. And Keir Starmer was acceptable to the establishment, and at the same time came out with platitudes about sticking to the the manifesto of 2019. It's time for real change. Well, he isn't really committed, of course, to that manifesto. What he's actually committed to is re-winning the trust of the establishment in the Labour Party, being a safe pair of hands. And in terms of the anti-Semitism campaign, of course, it's got nothing to do with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. There is no anti-Semitism problem in the Labour Party. No doubt there are ones and twos in the Labour Party who are anti-Semitic. But in terms of the Labour Party having some genuine problem, no, it does not. That is a big lie. But of course, this whole campaign actually symbolizes foreign policy. It symbolizes Britain's alliance with the United States, and the United States using Israel as its unsinkable aircraft carrier, its most reliable ally in the Middle East. If we look at Israeli politics, the dynamic of such a settler colony is to go to the right, to the right, to the right. And the nature of that settler colony, because it hasn't got any home country, is to actually look to some supporting great power. And certainly since 1967, that great power has been the United States. And where in terms of other allies in the Middle East for the United States, such as Iran, we're talking about under the Shah, of course, clearly unreliable. We could say the same about Saudi Arabia or any other such countries like Sisi's Egypt. These are not stable regimes, where if we look at the Israeli politics as a whole, not Netanyahu and Likud, but if we look at all the Zionist parties, they're all committed to the alliance with the United States. And that goes for the vast majority of Israeli citizens. That's what makes it a reliable ally for the United States. So really what this is about is ending the crisis in British politics in particular, that was highlighted by the Iraq War and then the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party. Capitalism's historic, certainly since 1945, second 11. Here was a reliable party that would back imperialist projects to an unreliable party, a party that couldn't be trusted. Now, you could ask yourself, and maybe there are some, that if Labour had adopted a Lexit position, everything would be different. I personally doubt that very much. To me, what would have been retained in the Midlands and in the north would have been lost in London. And a Lexit position, I think, would have also provoked rebellion in Corbyn's own ranks. And of course, we don't know that for definite, and we don't want to take too much time rerunning history on the basis of if only. It just seems unlikely to me that Labour adopting a different position on Brexit would have done it. Maybe if they boycotted the Cameron's referendum in 2016, said that we don't support referendums. Referendums are a dictator's device. Maybe things would have been different. But I'm not convinced. I think it's more a question to me in terms of our intellectual efforts. More effort has to go into me of why did the Labour Party do unexpectedly well in 2017 rather than why the Labour Party did expectedly badly in 2019. It would be the result you would expect under British conditions, of where, although there's been a mass influx into the Labour Party, in terms of ideas, in terms of real organisational cohesion, the Labour left was incredibly weak. And as an illustration of that, all we need to do is look at the sort of minor advances that the Labour left made in terms of reselection. There was some sort of minor change, but note that although we had this massive threat to deselect right-wing sitting MPs and adopt new ones, it just didn't happen. We saw up in Hull, for example, the threat to deselect, I can't remember her name, Johnson. It just didn't work. So the Labour left itself, although it was numerous, didn't have a clear vision, didn't have a clear leadership. And you can illustrate that, I think, by looking at the fate of Momentum. You can't just blame John Landsman for that. John Landsman's anti-democratic coup was backed by Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn's office was backed by John McDonnell, was backed by Diane Abbott. And what could have been a vehicle of discussion, of clarification, a weapon in the hands of left, was really reduced to the level of spear carriers for the Labour Party. It really was an organisation that was owned by one man. Okay. There's also just a question, not the few, but the many, and it's time for real change. I have seen it described, for example, by the Labour Representation Committee, but it's not alone, as a socialist manifesto. I think this is to abuse the commonly accepted language of socialism. For however radical this manifesto appeared to the establishment, to the Labour right, we need to understand that actually this wasn't a genuinely radical manifesto. Having been around long enough, I don't think it was that different to the sort of manifestos put out by Harold Wilson, in the 1960s. Look, what we would have had in terms of if Labour Party had got to office and had carried out this programme, was Britain still being a member of NATO, still being in a situation where it had nuclear weapons, controlled by the United States, would have still been in a situation of where we had sovereignty embodied with the monarch in Parliament. And that isn't just some feudal left over. Um, I never tire pointing out to comrades on the Labour left that if Jeremy Corbyn had led the Labour Party to a parliamentary majority, he would still have to be in a position of where he could rely on those sitting behind him to actually vote for him in a vote of confidence. And the reality would have been, quite conceivably, unless the Labour Party had been purged or you had such a massive influx of new MPs, that the majority of Labour MPs wouldn't have voted for Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister, and the monarch, through the Privy Council, would be advised thus. So maybe Jeremy Corbyn would have been invited to the palace, but I was speculating throughout this period, much more likely it was going to be someone like, believe it or not, Sir Keir Starmer, because Keir Starmer, although he was sitting in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, he was someone who was going to be acceptable to the establishment and could actually command a majority in Parliament. So the election of a Labour government led by Corbyn was never a certainty. Indeed, from my point of view, it was always highly unlikely. But okay, given that Corbyn's election as Labour leader itself was an accident of history, let's take one step and just imagine. Let's do an if and imagine there's Jeremy Corbyn through some, freak of the first past the post system, some freak about Brexit no longer having traction. There he is. He's elected on Time for Real Change. The PLP vote for him. The establishment doesn't dare keep him out of number 10. What happens? Well, to me, what happens is, the forces of the deep state start to move. As soon as Corbyn was elected leader, we had former generals, but as I understand it, also serving generals saying that we will not obey Corbyn's orders, which is a remarkable thing. We had former heads of MI5 and MI6 writing in the press saying, look, we used to follow this guy, we used to spy on this guy. That his advisors are not acceptable to us. And who's he talking about? He's talking about the straight leftists, people who used to be in a faction in the official Communist Party, i.e. Andrew Murray. I don't know exactly about Seamus Milne's status vis-a-vis the CPGB, but he was the business manager of this journal called Straight Left. And you had three key straight leftists around Corbyn, and basically MI5 saying these people have to be given the sack if we allow you to become Prime Minister. Well, if he hadn't given them the sack, what would have happened? Well, maybe there would have been a military coup, but I doubt it. Why? Because the United States didn't find Corbyn acceptable, and the United States controls the global banking system. And if we cast our minds back to previous sessions at this communist university, 1956 has been mentioned when Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt and took over the Suez Canal. Nasser was the Adolf Hitler #2, and the United States turned around and said, no, you can't do that. Well, the United States would have turned around to the British electorate and saying, you cannot have Jeremy Corbyn and this program, this unreliable program, and this unreliable prime minister. He's not acceptable to us. And you would have had a US organized run on the pound. All sorts of other eventualities are possible. Mike Pompeo said it, didn't he? Well, if that happens, we will push back. And we should have taken that seriously. So although I'm not saying we shouldn't have voted Labour, what we should have been doing in terms of the left, the genuine left in the Labour Party, is not fostering illusions that this programme was doable. It wasn't doable. We needed to actually show people that the monarch, the establishment, the Privy Council, the generals, the secret state, the American allies, the EU would have organized against such a government to bring such a government down. And such a government that's suffering a run on the pound, that's in the midst of an economic crisis, is hardly in a position to end austerity. Just like in Greece, the danger is that such a government is elected to fight austerity, but actually ends up being the agent of austerity. Now, in terms of if you're carrying out a revolution, you don't kid your base that everything's going to be fine, that it's just a matter of putting an X on a box and we will deliver, all sorts of goodies to you. So we needed actually to issue warnings about what to expect, but at the same time, we actually needed to be raising sights. Crucially, we needed to be organizing people. And it has to be said that collectively, the genuine left failed. Some of us failed, I think, because we're not strong enough to have carried out that course. But we were also in a situation of where, for some on the left, the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party was a disaster. And so we had previous dyed-in-the-wool auto-Labourites, such as the Socialist Party in England and Wales, as basically looking upon the election of Corbyn as the worst possible thing that could have happened to them. Of course, they didn't say it, but that was the truth of it, and we all know it. And the same, I think, is true of the Socialist Workers' Party. It was warning people, don't join the Labour Party because this will divert you from where the real struggle is, and that is in the street. Now, for me, I wouldn't counterpose, I'm an orthodox Marxist. I wouldn't counterpose, the fight in the ballot box, the fight in the committee rooms against street work, against street demonstrations. Actually, those different forms should complement each other, should strengthen each other. But for the SWP, people being involved in the internal fight in the Labour Party was a diversion. It shouldn't have happened. Now, what should have happened, and we shouldn't dismiss these groups as merely, well, they only consist of 1,000 people or 2,000 people. What you've got in these groups is activists. What you've got is potential leaders. What you've got is experienced people in terms of left-wing politics who could have given enormous strength if they'd been properly led to the Labour left. Now, no doubt we would have been in fights with these comrades and arguments with them. There's nothing wrong with that. But instead, what we had, to all intents and purposes, is a boycott of the class struggle that was being fought out in the Labour Party. Now, the bourgeoisie knew perfectly well that this was a class struggle, that the anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism campaign wasn't against anti-Semitism. It was against the Labour left. It was against the anti-war movement. It was about putting British imperialism back where it should have been, and that is as a loyal, trustworthy number one ally of the United States, one of the Five Eye core imperialist powers. So we had a left that in part boycotted the class struggle in the Labour Party, but we also had an official left, but also others who I still class as comrades and on what I'm calling the genuine principled or Marxist left, whatever criticisms I've got of them, who adopted a tailist position towards Jeremy Corbyn. We mustn't do anything unless Jeremy Corbyn tells us to do it. And I think you can see that illustrated when it came to Clause 4. We didn't even manage to restore the old Clause 4 of Sidney Webb and the Fabians of 1918, which of course, again, wasn't genuine socialism. Wage labor continues. This is state capitalism. Nonetheless, we didn't even do that. And certainly when we put forward our Marxist clause 4, we basically got from the left a non-plus position. This is far too advanced, but that was true of everything. That anything that wasn't in the manifesto was too much for the Labour left. And the Labour left too often simply viewed itself as the supporting act, which becomes extraordinarily difficult when the Labour left itself then becomes problematized. And not just problematized by the establishment, the Daily Telegraph, Jewish Chronicle, the Daily Mail, but by Jeremy Corbyn, the NEC, and Jenny Formby and the Labour Party HQ itself. And I'm not going to go over the witch hunt in particular. We all know it. But it became, under the Corbyn regime, under Jenny Formby, an offence to actually deny that the Labour Party had a genuine, real problem with anti-Semitism. This is under Jenny Formby. You had this offence of denialism, which is just incredible. It really is Salem-like levels of irrationality. But who got kicked out? Who got purged? Well, I'm sure there were some genuine real fruit cases who went down. And by the way, I actually favor, at least initially, with such people who've got weird ideas about, Jewish banking system and all that sort of stuff. The first line of attack should not be expulsion. It should be debate, frank and fierce debate. Let's argue with people. But who got kicked out? Tony Greenstein, Jackie Walker, Stan Keeble of the Labour Party Marxist. And of course, the purge has gone beyond the Labour Party. And we're seeing all sorts of attacks on academia, local councils, and it looks like it will run and run. Who knows what we have in store. But when you get Trump, for example, attacking Amnesty International as being an example of anti-Semitism, wow. And then you look at what happened in Washington and look at his supporters. Either way, what we had is a situation of where the left in the Labour Party was not equipped to take advantage of this historic accident, but then nor was the left outside the Labour Party equipped to do any such thing. And indeed, I think it is just worthwhile reminding ourselves that the General Secretary of the Morning Stars CPGB actually wrote, not to Jenny Formby, but her predecessor, and said, well, if there's any members of the CPB who've joined the Labour Party, I will give you their names. In the middle of a witch hunt, promising to name names, absolutely shameful position. Okay. So what did Corbyn do? Well, Corbyn not only became an agent of the witch hunt, he began, of course, as an appeaser of the witch hunt. Instead of fighting the Jewish labor movement and fighting labor friends of Israel, he attempted to court them. He attempted to please them by kicking out his own allies. I've already mentioned a few, but Chris Williamson, Ken Livingstone, these people were considered, expendable because the conviction was, when it came to a general election, the Labour Party would ride into office. Anyway, I've dealt with that particular one. Okay, so what I want to do, it's what's the time? So I'm just going to start to wind up now. I've had nearly 45 minutes, so I think I'll stick to the 45 minutes-ish sort of type thing, is to put forward a couple of propositions. And that is, first of all, I don't think that the Labour Party can be reformed. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean by that changes can't happen in the Labour Party. The history of the Labour Party has shown that the Labour left can make advances. Sometimes it suffers defeats. But what I mean by that is I don't think it can be reformed into an instrument of socialism. And what I mean by reform is peaceful, by the rules, abiding by the laws of the land. I don't think that the bourgeoisie, I don't think that the establishment, I don't think the state will allow us to do it. That doesn't mean I don't think that the Labour Party isn't winnable for the forces of Marxism. In the same way, I actually think that local councils are winnable by the forces of Marxism. So are regional councils. I also happen to believe that the House of Commons is winnable by the forces of Marxism. But if I then went on to say that the British state can be reformed, and it can be reformed into an instrument of socialism, that's what I mean about the Labour Party. The establishment will fight us tooth and nail. And ultimately, what would be required is us basically, either being expelled or expelling. And the second proposition I'm going to put forward is that in terms of transforming the Labour Party, in terms of actually realizing socialism, while the Labour Party might play a role here, while the House of Commons might play a role, or why local government might play a role, what is essential and what isn't being addressed by comrades on the left, both inside the Labour Party or outside the Labour Party, is the necessity of a mass Marxist party. I can call it a communist party. I'm not particularly fussed about the name, but a mass communist party that can work in the Labour Party in spite of the rules, can work in the Labour Party under changed rules, but doesn't rely on transforming the Labour Party as the core of its strategy, and therefore the election of a Labour government at the core of its strategy for socialism. So what I'm arguing is that in terms of the Labour left, it's doomed to a Labour of Sisyphus if it doesn't actually put forward the idea and doesn't commit itself to the idea of building a mass Marxist party. The last point that I want to deal with really is, what I began with, and that is to distinguish between the official Labour left and what we ought to be fighting for, and that's a principled Labour left. The Labour left, in my view, and the Labour right have a symbiotic relationship. I've heard some comrades on the Labour Party left saying that unity between the Labour right and the Labour left is impossible. Well, sorry, comrades, look back to the history of the Labour Party since it was formed in 1900. The Labour left has always been there. What is intolerable for the Labour right is not the presence of the Labour left. It's the position of the Labour left when it threatens the dominant position of the Labour right. So Bennism had to be fought. Corbyn had to be fought. But before the election of Corbyn, I mean, just think back to Tony Blair. Did he bother purging the Labour left? The Labour left was so weak that he didn't need to. Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell were rebelling all the time. They were revolting. Didn't need to threaten them, didn't need to expel them, didn't need to deny the parliamentary whip. So there is a unity between these two wings, and the role of the Labour left is to attract trade union militants, is to attract socialists, and it is to hold out the hope in terms of Labour's left-wing base that the next Labour government will be different from the previous Labour government. But the role of the right is to be the realistic wing, to be the dominant wing, the trustworthy wing. And as long as the left doesn't interfere with that too much, the Labour left can play a useful role. Indeed, what happens is the Labour people join the Labour Party, often on the left with the best of convictions, and they become the next generation of Labour rightists. And we accuse them all of being traitors, of being turncoats, and of course they are. But I think we need to understand that that is in the nature of the Labour left, the careerist Labour left. And what we need is a principled Labour left that doesn't seek to sit in shadow capitalist or pro-capitalist cabinets, let alone sit in an actual capitalist government. Now, that was a debate that the socialist movement had way back early in the 20th century. But when you raise it now on the Labour left amongst principled comrades, it appears to be some sort of foreign concept. It's like referendums. You know, you'd find Clement Attlee, Ramsay MacDonald, the whole of the Labour Party denouncing referendums, only now for people to view it as some sort of common sense. In other words, what I'm arguing is that the Labour left and the general political culture of the left in general has gone through a deterioration. And in terms of a fight back, what we need to be doing is, as well as agitating and organizing, is we need to be educating the left about its own history and developing our own program for the circumstances that we face in 2021. That's it. Thanks, Yoli.